Welcome to Gospel Tangents, the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett, and we're a proud member of the Dialogue Podcast Network. Dialogue, a journal for Mormon thought, celebrates the honest intellectual inquiry and the visual and literary arts. They have thrived for more than 50 years because of generous donations and subscriptions. They are currently running their annual drive and offer great ways to get the journal and other products like the Dialogue Book Club and supporting the Dialogue Podcast Network. We encourage our listeners to subscribe at dialoguejournal.com/subscribe. That's dialoguejournal.com/subscribe. Now on to our conversation with historian Don Bradley. You know, Don's one of the funniest Mormon historians that I know. In our first episode, we're going to talk about my first memory of hearing Don for the first time on a paper called Dating Fanny Alger. And so we're going to actually get into a little bit of the story with Fanny Alger. And Don thinks that Fanny might have been pregnant. So that's pretty interesting. Check out our conversation. All right, well, welcome to Gospel Tangents. I have one of my favorite historians and the funniest historian that I think that I've ever. Actually, tell us who you are first.
I'm Don Bradley.
And you've just written a book.
Yes.
What's it called?
The Lost 100 Pages. Sorry, can I start that over? The Lost 116 Pages, Reconstructing the Book of Mormon's Missing Stories.
Well, this is a fabulous book. I've gotten a few chapters in, and this is going to be really exciting. But can I tell you my first memory of you was, believe it was at Mormon History Association, and I believe the title of your paper was Dating Fanny Alger.
Yeah.
And I remember how you started out your paper. You said, by all accounts, Fanny was hot.
Yeah. That's what people said. Very, very comely, I believe is what they said. Yes.
So anyway, maybe we'll talk about her at the end, but let's talk a little bit about your book. So before we do that, though, the one thing that I would like to do, I always like to find out people's academic history. I know you've been at Utah State, but
sure.
And did you go to BYU as well? I can't remember.
I did my bachelor's in history at BYU.
That's what I thought.
And then I went back later, back to school later to Utah State to work with Philip Barlow to do a master's in history.
Yeah. I just saw Philip this week, actually. He's down here in Provo now. Did you know that?
Yeah.
Oh, you knew that. So I didn't know that. So he went from Utah State down to Maxwell Institute now. So,
yeah.
So that was kind of funny. So is he working on a book or anything? Do you know?
He's working on a book about the pre-existence.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll have to get him on too, so.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, great. So do you claim more Aggie or Cougar?
Oh, I didn't pick up a strong Aggie identity when I was there. I feel more BYU, but I absolutely adored my time at Utah State. Mm-hmm. I loved being in that program. I loved working with Phil. I loved every one of my classes. I loved the program. The program there, the Master's in History, is very flexible. I got to really choose what I wanted to study. It's amazing. I don't know if you know Chris Blythe.
A little bit. I know him a little bit. Yeah, okay.
A little bit ahead of me. That was fantastic.
Yeah. All right. So I know that you were a research assistant with Brian Hales in the polygamy volumes. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So Brian Hales is an anesthesiologist who's done thousands of hours of research on polygamy. Brian had first done a book on Mormon fundamentalist polygamy. The people are still practicing polygamy today. And I had actually provided some research findings to him that I had made on that. Once he was finished with that, he decided he was going to tackle Joseph Smith and polygamy. And Brian, to make sure that his work was credible and that it was complete, he wanted to gather every source that had ever been cited in anything that had ever been written on Joseph Smith and polygamy. And I think at the time he didn't really know what he was getting into, just how many sources that would be. I'm sure he did.
Hence it's 3 volumes.
And he wanted to see what other news sources could be found. Now, since he had a, job at a hospital, like he wasn't able to be an archive rat and just go delve for all these things. So he was thinking, who could I hire? And so he thought of me.
It's nice when you're a physician, right? And you have lots of money to burn.
Right. It worked for everybody. So Brian hired me to find all the known sources on Joseph Smith's polygamy and then some. And so in the resulting 3 volumes that Brian wrote, there were some 1,500 sources used. And the vast majority of those sources I gathered. Again, sources in some cases that had been cited by previous authors. In other cases, new sources that had never been, that we located that had never been used before. I got to go to, day by day, I was at the LDS Church Archives. And then I got to travel twice back to the Beinecke Library at Yale, which was amazing, and look at original sources that they have there from Mormon history, really some surprising things, and the D. Michael Quinn collection, which is a gold mine that really needs to be made more use of. And so I gathered the sources and I analyzed sources as well, helping Brian figure out what was going on with the sources. And the larger interpretations in the books are his, for sure, and he's the author. But he would ask questions and I would go figure them out. And so a lot of cool things that resulted, a lot of unexpected findings. One of the coolest moments actually was examining Andrew Jensen's handwritten list of Joseph Smith's wives. So Andrew Jensen published the first really authoritative list of Joseph's wives in 1886. He listed 27 plural wives. So Jensen's list was a black box. Basically, we didn't know, how did he come up with the list? And so I looked at his journals, I looked at his newly available sources at the church archives, his handwritten notes, set number of sheets. And from those notes, I was actually able to figure out what he did, who he talked to, when, even though the notes don't actually say. They say sometimes, but they usually don't say who he was talking to. They just record the person's answers. But it was possible from various clues, linking it with his journals, with other people's journals, with internal evidence in the documents, to figure out at almost every point who was talking to him, what they were telling him. And I realized at one point, looking at his larger handwritten list of the wives, that the middle portion of the list was definitely not in his handwriting. And as I tried to figure out whose it was, there was reason to think it was Eliza Snow, because there were journals that showed that he had talked to her during this time. And so I compared with Eliza's handwriting, found a match. I'm not an Eliza or a handwriting expert, so I asked Jill Durr, who is a big Eliza expert, to look at it with me, along with Brian, and she confirmed that there was every reason to conclude that that was Eliza's handwriting. And so we were able to show one of the areas where that was extremely important, actually, was figuring out where Jensen got his information about Fanny Alger, or as I've actually since learned from the family, Fanny Alger. It turns out, although I've been saying it the other way for years, and that's how it's in my head, it's actually Fanny Alger. Jensen was the first person to give her full name as a plural wife of Joseph Smith, and officially state she was definitely a wife rather than like a mistress or something, And so where did he get this information? Well, she was one of the ones that Eliza wrote on the list. And Eliza gave him further information in his notes about Joseph's relationship with Fanny Alger. And Eliza indicates in those notes that she remembered what had happened when Joseph kicked Fanny out of Emma kicked Fanny out of the house, because Eliza lived in the Smith home at the time. Now, most people don't realize Eliza R. Snow lived in the Smith home more than once. A lot of people know she lived in the Smith home in Nauvoo, which is where there's controversy about she fell down the stairs, did Emma push her, and all that sort of
That was the first thing that came to my mind.
Yeah. Which Emma didn't push her, by the way. That's the best evidence. The story actually doesn't match even the setup of the stairway in the house and so on. There's really no reason to think that's what happened. But Eliza's autobiography and other sources show Eliza had lived with the Smiths in Kirtland in 1836 before she lived with them in Nauvoo, and that tongue-in-cheek title of the presentation that you mentioned earlier, Dating Fanny Alger, was, of course, the paper was actually about dating the incident of Emma's discovery of Joseph's relationship with Fanny Alger. And through various lines of evidence, we can actually place that in a 2 or 3 week window in the summer of 1836, which is later than people have thought. And it actually ends up having quite a few implications. A big part of doing history is actually just lining things up in their proper order. Once you get the sequence of events right, you can see the causation. You can watch the dominoes fall. But if you don't have the dominoes in the right order, you can't see what caused what and what made what to happen. Once you place Emma's discovery of that relationship in the proper place, you can suddenly see why there are various people in Kirtland dissenting, why Joseph Smith takes off on a sudden trip, goes somewhere else for a while, why Fanny Alger suddenly takes off and goes the opposite direction to Indiana. It lines up beautifully once you get things in the proper order. But a key piece of that evidence was actually identifying Eliza R. Snow's contribution to Andrew Jensen's research. And it helps to show that this was a marriage, that Eliza R. Snow, who was around at the time, was there in the house. She didn't think that this was an affair. Her understanding was this was an early plural marriage. So it has lots of implications. So it's fun stuff. Yeah.
This is great. Yeah. Can we stay here for a minute? Because I have a lot of questions about this.
Sure.
So, as I recall, and please correct me if I'm wrong, it seems like you're making the case that this marriage to Fanny happened after the Elijah visit. Was it in March or April of 1836?
Yeah. So that's a possibility that I'm raising, and it may be. It was pointed out to me immediately after the presentation, actually by 2 Community of Christ apostles who were there, that for a woman at the time of her first pregnancy, she usually starts showing a little bit later. Fanny, the reports say, was visibly pregnant at the time Emma discovered the relationship. And so the chronology there might not work for the relationship to begun after April 3rd, because Fanny would have had to have had the time to get pregnant and then start showing before Emma discovered the relationship, according to some of the sources.
Wasn't it discovered in a barn?
Yes, but she was also said to have been visibly pregnant. And the people who are saying this are actually the people whose home Emma, I keep saying that, Fanny moved into when she was kicked out of the Smith home. So they would know. So a likely sequence of events is Fanny's showing signs of pregnancy, maybe morning sickness, starting to show, right? And that makes Emma suspicious something is going on. And so she starts following Fanny's movements more and finds her, Joseph and Fanny together in the barn. There's a lot more that hopefully can still be figured out about it, but it's at least in the realm of possibility. It's at least quite plausible that it only happens after that the marriage only happens after the coming of Elijah. In that case, she'd have to get pregnant very quickly, right, and then start showing is probably like sometime in July, maybe. I'm trying to remember the dates. This is not fresh in my mind, but like I've got a detailed chronological window for that, using the different, her uncle and who helps her get out of town and other sources like that. So yeah, it definitely has implications for understanding what was going on there, and links it to other. There are a couple sources that say Benjamin Winchester, and then I believe actually even John Whitmer in his official history that he's writing, both say that in 1836 polygamy appears in Kirtland. Well, Joseph's relationship with Fanny Alger is discovered in 1836. So they are understanding that relationship to have been polygamy. And these are not people who are friendly to what Joseph was doing, so they would have no reason they don't approve of polygamy at all. They hate it, they think it's evil. So they would have no reason for them, Joseph's behavior being polygamy rather than adultery wouldn't have been any better, And so, anyway, there are various things about the chronology that would suggest pretty strongly that it was understood as polygamy at the time.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation with historian Don Bradley. In our next conversation, we're going to tackle the famous quote, "The dirty, nasty, filthy affair," that is supposedly by Oliver Cowdery. But did Oliver really say it?
And so people are like, well, there you go, Oliver Cowdery at the time thought that it was adultery, so why would we think it was polygamy? What I noticed when I looked at the Church Archives microfilm is that there was something funny. The word affair was written over top of another word. And I was like, what is that word? Because this seems to be a key, right? Like, if Oliver originally wrote some other word, and then affair is written over it, you have to understand the letter book was not written by Oliver. So Oliver wrote the original letter to his brother. Then Oliver's nephew took that original letter, copied it into the letter book for Oliver, and the change is made in the handwriting of Oliver's nephew. So the nephew is changing what Oliver said to something else. So the word affair isn't Oliver's word. Oliver's original word is underneath that word, and I had to know what it was, because everybody for decades has cited this. Like, here you go. We've got the goods. It was an affair.
If you'd like to hear the entire interview uncut, please support Gospel Tangents and become a subscriber. For just $5 a month, go to patreon.com/gospeltangents, and you can hear the entire interview. And you can also get transcripts available at either our Amazon website, or if you want to give the money to me and not Amazon, please subscribe on my website at gospeltangents.com, and you can click the yellow subscribe button. Of course, we're also on Facebook, Twitter, and all the other places. Make sure you subscribe on iTunes at tinyurl.com/gospeltangents. And don't forget to click here to subscribe on YouTube, here for a transcript. And over here, we've got some more of our great videos. Thanks again for listening.